Dear student, faculty, staff, and guests, first I would like to thank you all for being here. We're pleased to have Mr. Jane Peter Alters, the Director of World Bank in Kosovo, in our campus today. The Economist Club, in cooperation with the student and government, has invited Mr. Jane Peter Alters to elaborate on the topic on Kosovo's economy and growth opportunities, and also offer the possibility to interact with the students of our community. Now I would like to proceed with a brief biography. Mr. Alters joined the World Bank in 2007 when he served as country office in Montenegro till 2011, and from 2011 he holds the position of country manager in Kosovo. Mr. Alters holds a doctorate degree in economics from McGill University in Canada. Please join in welcoming Mr. Jane Peter Alters, the Director of World Bank in Kosovo, for his speech.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, and I think a very important, critical period of time. If we can talk about something that is a little bit more medium term, it's probably at the beginning of a mandate of a new government. You might or might not like the government, but at least there is now a time to really look at what are the challenges that have to be addressed in a 4-year period, rather than talking about more shorter-term tactical political issues. Clearly, if we look at the situation that we have here in Kosovo, and I will just talk about, where can I move to the slides?
You have an assistant
Perfect. And you know probably a whole lot better than I do. There are a number of very interesting features, and some of them seem slightly contradictory. Generally, if we look back at recent years, there has been consistent growth in this country. It's one of 3 countries in Europe that has grown in every single year throughout the global financial Eurozone crisis. It's been solid, it's been resilient, but it's not been spectacular. And I think just to make that point, if we look at the 2011-2014 growth experience in Kosovo, relative to other economies in the world over that period of time, you see it is roughly average. Actually, it is slightly below the world average of growth. It is better than emerging Europe. It's certainly better than the EU. But the growth story is one that is clearly linked to the starting point. And if we compare our current position relative to other countries in Europe, Kosovo remains one of the poorest countries in Europe, which of course defines the particular sets of challenges going forward. Next. And this is probably the Achilles heel of Kosovo's economy generally. The labor market outcomes, both in terms of employment and unemployment, is very poor. And within the labor market, if you look at the various segments, at 30% unemployment, for instance, Kosovo has one of the highest unemployments in Europe. But if you look at female, in particular if you look at youth unemployment, and within that, female youth unemployment, it is actually quite alarming. And I think here you see that not only the numbers per se, but also the developments give some reason for concern. And again, looking at young female, the young female segment of the population, that's the one segment that doesn't seem to have benefited from the gradual modest improvement that we seem to have seen in the labor market. That's the one segment that seems to have decoupled from development elsewhere. And you see this here at the very lower corner, at an employment rate of just 4.6%, it stayed stable, while unemployment has increased. I don't know whether anyone was there yesterday at the D4D discussion on the integration of women into the labor market, but this is sort of the one part that is really critically important to ensure that the focus will include or will have to include the female segment of the labor market, because Kosovo in the end cannot afford not to. Like any other features, if you have several candidates that apply for a job and you do not pick the best and most productive one, a company suffers. If you do that consistently on a country level, that has a clear development impact, and that clearly it's not only a gender issue, but it's also a minority issue, that's ethnic, religious, linguistic. Next, second big Achilles heel of the Kosovo economy are still very large external imbalances. If you look here at the difference between imports and exports, you see, I'm sure you know it, it's still a very import-reliant economy. We see slight increases in exports. January to September, there was 6.4% increase in export. Interestingly, a very large increase of about 115% of export went to Serbia. Macedonia is a very important trading partner, so there is something that is developing in terms of regional integration. I think that is a good sign that so taking the steps from import substitution that I think we see particularly in the agriculture sector, food processing, but I think we see also in the figures an increasing amount, but also then as a next step some improvements in terms of regional export before we really get to try to become competitive as a country in Europe as a whole. And that is, I think, in the end, one of the big advantages that Kosovo has. It is right next to a very large market with a high purchasing power. 500 million customers within the EU, and Kosovo has privileged access to that market. So I think in terms of a longer-term objective, there is a very strong feature that, next slide, we can work on. These were sort of the what I see the fundamental preconditions in this debate that I hope we, Kosovo, you amongst yourselves, you with the politicians, are going to have in terms of ways to accelerate growth. If you look back and if you remember the first slide, the growth differential between Kosovo and the European Union has been 2.6% during the years 2011-2014. A 2.6% growth differential, which in itself is not bad, but what are the implications? At current levels of per capita GDP, which represents about 11.1% of the EU average, it will just take a really long, probably far too long time period to catch up with the average income level in the EU. And I think the quintessential challenge in economic policy making is to see ways to accelerate growth rates and so doing reduce the time that is required to reach EU income levels. And even though year by year any acceleration growth might be low and it doesn't have any tangible impacts, the compound effects are very large indeed. So if there is a way to increase growth, the growth differential from about 2.5 to 5%, we can reduce the time to catch up with the EU from 80 to 40 years. We essentially cut it in half. 5% growth differential, given that the EU is not growing very fast at all, and it's sort of has been less than 1%, is not impossible if you see what are the potentials. I mean, at this stage, it is mainly catch-up growth. Moving towards the technological and innovative frontier, and then close the gaps that I identified here. So a lot of those decisions, as can also be seen by other countries that have tried to take advantage of this catch-up, can be done. there has been, and you can find it on the internet, in 2008, the worst possible year to publish that. A very important report called the Growth Report. It's been a commission by 22 economists, policymakers on the highest levels that have recruited a lot of others. They've tried to distill what are really the lessons learned from those countries that over a period for more than 25 years have grown by more than 7%. In the end, there were just 13 countries that have managed to do that. But these 13 countries were very heterogeneous. They were in Europe and they were in Asia, they were big and small, they were landlocked and they were at the sea, they had natural resources and they didn't have. I think the heterogeneity of the countries has been a good feature. But it's really, I think it's a good read. It's written quite nicely. It has very important lessons that I have integrated to some extent in the next slide, where I sort of try to also structure for myself what would need to be done, where things would need to be done in the attempt to accelerate growth rates in Kosovo. There are sort of in summarizing the last few slides, two, I think, defining features of Kosovo's economy. On the one hand, on the macro-fiscal side, Kosovo has maintained stability. You have maintained monetary and price level stability, largely because you have adopted the euro as a sole legal tender. The very stringent and tight fiscal rules have contributed to the fiscal situation having remained stable. Again, maybe not for the right reasons, but in 2014 again, it looks like the budget deficit will be at or below 2%. Largely because capital expenditures were far less than they were initially budgeted, but also countering the fact that the revenue taxes came in much slower than had been budgeted initially. But this is in many ways a strong feature. Public debt is still at about 10% of GDP. Might be twice that if we take into account London and Paris Club, but that hinges directly on, which is currently serviced by Serbia. And it automatically becomes Kosovo's if and when Serbia recognizes Kosovo's independence. But even at 20%, it is still at a very manageable level. So one part of economic policies, and I don't think I really have to convince you on that, is to keep focusing on maintaining that what is good and strong in Kosovo's economy and build on the other features that are not. And on the other features, if you look at the blue boxes from the back, I think looking back to the last campaign, granted it's not been a while, I think the one nice feature of that campaign was that every single party focused on jobs as the single most important issue faced by Kosovo in the years to come. You all disagreed on how to do it, but at least I think there was a clear identification that a next government and the success or failure of the next government will be judged by the ability to create an environment that facilitates the creation of jobs. That in turn, the weak labor market is a reflection of the narrow production base reflected in the external imbalances. And that in turn is a reflection of low domestic productivity. And low productivity is not really competitiveness. Personally, I don't particularly like the term competitiveness because it often means lowering standards and wages. That is not really Kosovo's problem. But the low productivity and the linkages that exist between available capital and labor and all the inputs that feed into the production function, I think that combination is still not as strong as it can be. And once I think there is an agreement that domestic productivity is the key to unlock growth rates that are more endogenous, that come more from within, rather than growth that has been fueled by foreign aid, by remittances, by public investments. That has helped, but it is not sustainable. So the various elements that will help to do that I see are essentially four, and then those are reflected in these gray boxes that you see on the slide here. The one element I think that is critical, given the type of growth that we're aiming at, the catch-up growth, is really to be as open as possible to import ideas, knowledge, technology from abroad. This can happen in many ways. Clearly, often we talk about attracting foreign direct investment. Yes, that is one way of importing technology and standards from abroad. And when we are talking about attracting FDI and discussions, probably one of the most controversial discussions in terms of economic policies that Kosovo has had on privatizations, to me it seems the discussion always has been focused on the wrong parts. The discussion has been on how much does the budget get. Yes, it's important, but of course, a lot of discussion has been on whether the process has been right. The governance bit of it, yes, it's also very important that this is done right. But I think one of the critical issues that has not been discussed a lot is the ability that a privatization can or won't bring into moving a sector up to the technological frontier and increasing productivity in that particular sector. I think if we look, for instance, at the banking sector, where we have seen quite a bit of foreign investment, that has developed into a sector that has moved in this direction and has helped in a number of ways to be one of the anchors of Kosovo economy. Granted, there's still discussions, access to capital, high interest rates, a very conservative conduct of the banking sector, but it has not dragged down the economy, and I think net it has helped the economy. And it's a constructive discussion, what else can happen in that sector. Kosovo has a number of industries where the movement towards the technological frontier can bring immense benefits. Energy, clearly one of them. Mining, clearly one of them. Telecommunications, clearly one of them. Insurance sector, clearly one of them. And agriculture, food processing. There are many low-hanging fruits where with some focus and some linkages to what is happening elsewhere, this can be achieved. The other area, and I think you're the best example of that, is foreign education. To link that with domestic education. The more education is open and there is an exchange and the ability to effect academic cross-fertilization, I think the more this will help to really make the labor market here an attractive one. That is the one block of just being open. And where Kosovars try to do that, and sometimes they do succeed. And it starts, I think the most evident cases are in sports. And you've got world-class athletes, and whether it's in judo or in football. And this can be exported to other sectors as well. Second one is probably a slightly more difficult one. And that is the anchor of a growth model going forward. Because in the end, to really realize the investments that need to be done in the private sector and the public sector alike. To do that, you have to forego current consumption against the expectation that the benefits of the future, the net present value of future benefits, if you will, outweigh the opportunity cost of foregoing consumption now. That, of course, requires credible governments that you believe will actually deliver those benefits. You probably know my background is German, and there was, after World War II, this long debate on the economic model for the West German economy. Given the Nazi years and the experience there was a very strong preference by many to have a much more socialist system with nationalized means of production. And it was a very vitriolic debate between two sides whether it should be a more free market-based or more socialist-based economy. And it took about 10 years after the war until this was settled. And it was settled essentially by the model of what's called now a social market economy, by the, at the time, Minister of Economy, who made a very strong promise that increases in productivity will be forwarded as wage increases to the population at large. That has worked for quite some time, and I think some of the social problems that Germany has seen recently is the feeling that this promise seems to have been broken. It's a debate that is currently taking place. But that helped to make the sacrifices that are required, or the forgotten opportunities of consumption opportunities in the present, to make the investments for the future. Where I think Kosovo and the region as a whole receives some benefits is the fact that what is required to do these types of investments. It is physical investment, it is the investment in a legal framework, it is investments in institutions, all of that. Is the fact that your country's political objectives, namely EU integration, coincides to a large extent with the priorities of socio-economic development. That what you have to do for one objective are essentially congruent with what you have to do for the other. So that self-reinforcing political economic set of policy actions might help to push things forward to some extent. Lastly, the focus on what I mentioned here is functioning market economy. Functioning means that essentially the price signals can play the role of price signals. That people get jobs because of their education, skills and talents. That a tender is won on the basis of price and quality. All of these factors, where there are other elements that have intruded the market, that have clouded price signals, which make economic actions very difficult. And within that, I think the two main sectoral reforms that will have to be focused are in terms of energy and education. Energy, simply because I don't really have to summarize it. Maybe questions will come. It is a vulnerable sector, one that does not yet guarantee security of supply, and clearly a very important obstacle to attracting investment, both domestic and foreign. No one puts in expensive equipment if you cannot rely on energy. And similarly, education. Kosovo has had a very difficult legacy. It has to be the focus. Also looking at demographics and seeing where we currently are in terms of the labor market. There's a lot to do. Nothing is impossible, but with the right focus and the right vision of where the country wants to go, at least in broad principles, I think Kosovo has many features that could make it work. The mental picture that I have, and I close with that here before I ask for, open the floor for questions. The mental picture that I always have when I look at Kosovo economy is it's a chain that has a number of really strong links and a number of really weak links. But you cannot pull with that chain. You need to fix those links that are still weak. It is a challenge that I think Kosovo as a whole will have to face. It is government and opposition, it is civil society, it's the private sector, it's academia. Because if the growth model is long term, and not just 4 years, but 25 years, then probably everyone at some point within that time will be in government. And everyone should have an interest to make this work. Within a generation, Kosovo, I think, has the potential of being like any other country in Europe. But it takes some effort, and it's not easy. It takes some confidence and trust, and a lot of discussion. And with that, I open the floor for that. Thank you.
Okay, if any of you want to raise a question. Hello, everybody. Do you think that the privatization of state assets is a positive or negative thing for the economy of Kosovo?
If you do it right, it could be a good thing. If you do it wrong, it's a bad thing. Again, I think one of the key features in discussing privatizations, and I'm glad you asked that question, is really what are the benefits that a privatization could bring in increasing the standards of that sector and bring it more in line with international standards and levels of productivity. And in that, allow that sector to prosper and grow. So one feature that is really important is, do you have investors of the quality to achieve that? If you've got a good investor with the ability and willingness to make the necessary investments to move that sector forward and then bring it to the technological frontier, it's a good thing. If not, I mean, there are failed privatizations that didn't work. I think it's not an a priori yes or no, good or bad. You have to look at the type of investor, the ability to move the technological frontier forward. You have to look at the process. You need some ownership. And some understanding why this is being done. So if all these features come together, it has the potential of being something positive. But I think we have to be also very clear where the risks are and make sure that the risks that are inherent in any privatization do not outweigh the expected benefits.
So I have a quick question. So when you're talking about improving the technological innovation in the sector, how do you see supporting that? You know, bringing the rest of the society up along with that technological innovation?
I think the answer is very clear. If you can do it, you can offer products or services ultimately at a lower price and a higher quality. Then you have increased productivity. And if you can do that, I think consumers are with you.
If I may continue on the same point, Alicia, I completely agree that focusing on increased productivity is very important if you want to move to the indigenous growth and rely less on foreign aid. But if you start listing those weak links in the chain, quality of education, healthcare, skills mismatch in the labor market, electricity supply and others, what are the chances for this increase in productivity?
Well, actually, the lower you are, the faster are the initial increases. And you probably also have these declining marginal rates of return. I think especially if you start to identify the weakest part and make efforts there, you actually have good chances. So let's take education. So the one innovation that will happen next year is that Kosovo, for the first time ever, will participate in the PISA assessment. Chances are Kosovo will not come out of that in any impressive way, but I think that doesn't matter. What it does is creates a benchmark, and it creates an understanding of where we really are. And on that basis, I think you can start to devise reforms to help to improve further on that system, and you have a permanent reassessment of whether that works. I think it's this is external quality control is a very important feature of moving an education system forward. As one example. Clearly, I think if and the tender is, as you know, is open. Hopefully, it will close successfully, maybe in a month's time. I mean, assuming there is a replacement of a 50-year power plant that is very fragile, polluting, inefficient, and all of that, with a modern state-of-the-art power plant that could be built inside the EU as well, yes, it will make a huge difference. If you can link that with the integration of the energy market with Albania, which is in many ways a perfect match between a hydro-based and a fossil-based market, one should see that, yes, you can rely on energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year. It is this. I know there's a lot of skepticism in the willingness and ability by the public sector to effect these changes. And a first step, I think, in that direction is to actually express expectations. What do you want a government to achieve? By being cynic and say nothing good will come out of that, in itself might prove counterproductive. The clearer and then the more open the debate on economic policy priorities is, I think the more chances the country will have to achieve that. I think one element that is particularly important in this, and where I think at least the political spectrum as a whole is involved by default or by constitution, foreign borrowing has to be ratified in Parliament with a 2/3 majority. That means the decision on what are economic development priorities, especially the expensive ones, energy might be one of them, that's where everyone has a say. And I think that's where this across the aisle debate on what really it is that the company needs to focus on for a period longer than just 4 years and can start, because these types of borrowings would be for projects that extend any given government's political mandate.
Thank you. My name is Derdan Latifi. I graduated from AUK in 2007.
Congratulations.
I was just wondering, what do you make of the size of the government in Kosovo? Like, what would you suggest to the new government? There's way too many ministries, in my opinion, and consequently, what do you think of the size of the public sector?
it's, well, we could talk about this for a really long time. To answer that, I would like to step back, because before we really answer whether government is too big or too small, I think we need to discuss what you want government to do and what you're willing to pay for it. There are different models and different successful models of how big a government can or should be. You can make many services private, or you can keep them public. So this debate exactly on what is the role of government in the economy, what do you expect from government, will then in turn have an implication on the size of government. And once you have defined the size of government, then of course you can talk about the structure of government. Would it make sense to have it split in many ministries, or can you consolidate that? That's sort of the third question of that. And I think to some extent there is still not a clarity on the expected role and size of government here, and the ability to finance it. So that has to square. And taxes generally are relatively low compared to neighboring countries. Your VAT is lower, your income taxes are lower, both corporate and personal. Yes, many complaints come from the fact that taxes at the border have to be paid up front, which creates a lot of difficulty for businesses because they have to pay taxes before they actually have the turnover. But the tax levels generally, I mean even customs are generally low. If we look at the size of government as a share of GDP, Kosovo is still among the countries that has a relatively small government, which at this state of development is probably more an advantage than it's a disadvantage. But we have not had, as far as I can see, this much deeper debate among different parts of society of what it really is that you want from government, which is natural. I'm looking at Kosovo's history. There has not been a lot of time, but that debate I think is critical. What do you want from government? And if you know that, you look at, okay, how would government have to work to make that happen? And that then defines the size.
Hello, I want to thank you for being today here. My question is, what should the government of Kosovo, the key priority be? I have checked the midterm policy priorities for the 2014 and 2016, but I think that there are just too many priorities and they are not realistic for the 2-year period. So what should be the priority above all other priorities in terms of growth? Thank you.
And in the end, government's priorities are defined through the budget. And more broadly over, first and then the medium-term expenditure framework, and then the annual budget. And if you look at the last government's mandate, I mean, there was clearly one priority. And you look at the budget, and particularly the capital budget, and you know what the priority was. Then the question is, should that have been the number one priority? And there are different opinions on that, and actually I'm pleased to see that there has been more and more of a debate. And okay, you can assess the past, and the past is the past, but going forward, where do we put our budgeted resources? They're constrained as they are, so you have to make a choice. The writing of strategies and defining of strategies, okay, everything is a priority, and there are so many things that need to be done here, but the decision is, okay, how do we now structure the decision making that of all the various priorities, which I think in the end probably are priorities for the country, but we have to rank them. And we have to start implementing them from the top down. And that will have to go through the budget. Again, I think here, in defining some of the really big priorities, in the sense of expensive priorities, that requires by default and through the constitution the involvement of everyone in parliament, because in the end it cannot be financed only through revenues, and these are big initial investments that will require some foreign financing with it and through it. I think that is really important that it is understood that this core consensus, I mean, you can disagree on many things, but there has to be some sort of a core consensus, I think, in the country of where you want the country to move to. And if you get that, I think it becomes a little easier to not only define priorities, but actually make them happen and realize them.
I have another quick question on that point, actually. How do you think it would be good to balance some of these large capital expenditures with improving the welfare and the needs of the household? You know, you look at something like energy efficiency, Kosovo is probably going to gain a lot more from improving individual households, and several of them. But they do still need the capital investments in the power plants and in the transmission lines and in larger scale projects. I mean, there's just not enough resources to go around for both, and so how do you find a way to balance small projects that will make a big difference and big projects that will also make a big difference?
And often they're intertwined. And your projection of energy demand over a medium to long-term horizon is a function of the ability to realize energy efficiency investments. Not only Kosovo, the region, the Western Balkans, is one of the most energy inefficient regions in the world. And clearly there are low-hanging fruits. And we are at the point where having not enough generation capacities, having constraints for imports, and a high degree of energy efficiency, and that creates then sort of a set of interlinked policy priorities. I think you cannot look at one separate from the other, which is one of the reasons why the energy sector has been so complex, and why it has taken probably a whole lot longer than initially thought, because these various elements suddenly intertwined, and in many ways Kosovo was unlucky as well. And there was some sort of, it was way before my time here, but there seemed to have been some sort of agreement in 2007, 2008 of where to go. And then two things happened, well, three things happened. Kosovo became independent. The global financial crisis dried up the availability of foreign finance, and then we started the global discussion on climate change and the impact of that could make something around that. So suddenly what seemed possible in 2007 was impossible as of 2008. And that required a readjustment at a very deep level, on all levels, and a very intense debate on what priorities are. I think we've ended up this debate, no, we haven't ended up. We have moved it forward to some sort of core consensus that energy efficiency has to be one part of the solution to making sure that the energy sector will be able to supply energy to all consistently. We cannot do it without that.
Okay, then I have another question. I completely agree with you that the size and the structure of the government should derive from the perception of individuals as to what government they want and how much government they want. But do you think that the current size of the government in Kosovo and its structure is derived from the perception of taxpayers and how much government they want? Let me give you just one example. In the municipality of Pristina, they lost several million euros on court cases for property issues simply because they didn't have a lawyer to send her to these cases, but the municipality could afford to have 18 drivers. So is this structure of the government derived from the needs of the citizens? And another question, your idea that the annual budget should reflect the priorities from the MTF. But was this the case in Kosovo? If you compare the budget and the MTF, could you see a reflection while drafting the budget on the priorities? For example, on year-by-year basis in the MTF we saw that healthcare is a priority, but we also saw the budget of healthcare going down. So what's happening there?
I think I agree with you in the sense we agree too much probably for it to be a real debate. The structure of public administration can be improved upon, can be made more efficient. But that means bigger or smaller, I think, is a separate issue. I think the one big reform that is outstanding or that is in the process of being implemented, but critical elements of which have been delayed, is public administration reform.
Finance level.
Co-financed. But I think this gives one step where we can look at, well, first of all, defining job positions. What is someone supposed to do in government? There are many positions that are not clearly defined, and I think it's important that we sort of, Kosovo has an idea who should deliver what part of the overall public good. And then if you do that, I think you automatically get into, yes, what is the structure that we're really aiming for? If we have ill-defined or undefined positions, it's very difficult to have this discussion. Clearly, I mean, if you've got an example that you lost large amounts of money because you didn't have the budget to finance a lawyer, clearly that was inefficient. The fiscal tightness should increase the interest and incentives to take these steps very, very seriously. Because in the end, to make it work with a relatively small government, given our current tax revenues, you have to look at increasing the value for money. And I think in that a periodic change in governments, and we have a new mayor in Pristina, you look at a structure again and identify changes that you think might improve things. Sometimes it's trial and error. I think there is no scientific formula, at least I'm not aware of one, that would define an optimal government structure. And even if you have it at year X, it might not be the right structure at year X plus 2. Simply because the challenges and the requirements for government change over time. So I think it's a constant process in many ways. One that requires certain instruments, and I think Kosovo at this point doesn't have all the instruments yet to really have a rational discussion on that. I think, and I hope that with a successful job classification and required TORs, and that these reforms will help to move in that direction and really making the choices of, yes, what it is that we really need, and where do we have maybe access, support, maybe even access support in a certain part of government, maybe even just the reallocation might increase efficiency. So I think there are many issues that defy a simple answer. But yes, there are, I think, many opportunities to make government more efficient.
You said we need to choose the right investors. Are we doing that?
And then you see it. think in many parts it has worked okay. It's not. How to answer that question? And Kosovo is in a difficult position. It is at this point on no one's A-list of where foreign companies really want to go. Kosovo has to make a case. It has some disadvantages that it can't help. It is small, and it can't change that. It is landlocked, and can't change that. It has a number of it's a certain stage. It has a certain history. It has a certain legacy. All of that. So it is not a natural number one for most companies to look at. I think one way that really would help not only Kosovo, but I think the region as a whole, is really the more it gets to being looked at a region of, 12 million, rather than 2 million, it becomes a whole lot more attractive. And having the access to the EU, even more so. I once one Kosovo entrepreneur told me, and I think if that sinks in, it will have a lot of potential. He said, what we want to do is to offer German quality at bargain prices. If you get there, the interest will be huge. Even if you just get halfway there. It is a battle every single time, and something has to give. And again, yes, we have to look at all the aspects of when it comes to attracting investors. It is the price, it is the quality of the firm, it is the process, it's all of that. And it's most importantly, or very importantly, the ability to really effect improvements in the way goods are produced or services are provided. I think Kosovo has had some good examples and some examples that are not that good. I think if you look at, say, the airport, as far as I can tell, we weren't involved in that. I haven't looked at any details, but that seems to have been an area where foreign involvement has been very beneficial.
I've got a question. Is Brazilica considered as a good thing that they privatized it for 410 million euros, where 10 meters square is considered about 27 cents of euro? Is that a good thing that government did in the time where people are leaving Kosovo due to the lack of jobs?
I haven't looked. It's not been any project that the World Bank has supported. I haven't looked at. I've read the newspapers as you have. I answer a little bit hypothetically. As I said, the price is one element to look at. The investments into the asset is another one. And then, yes, sometimes that has to be balanced. If there's a legal commitment to realize investments, there's a certain trade-off. I have no firm opinion on that. I haven't looked at it carefully enough to have formed an opinion on that. Yes, I've read, like all of you, that the per square meter price has been very low. But I cannot really now square it to see whether it really makes sense or doesn't make sense. A priori, I have so far no opinion on that, and then I have to look at it much more closely before I can answer that.
You should also maybe consider the legal aspects of the contract. I've seen the contract. According to it, if the investor fails to deliver or decides to withdraw, the government of Kosovo takes the responsibility to repay up to 95% of the outstanding debts of the firm. which is technically a contingent liability that must go through the parliament, which government did not respect in this case. So the contract for Brezovita is legally questionable, so at least at this point, at this stage.
I think it's important that these things are looked at. Again, I've not looked at the contract, and so far the only information that I have is through the media.
I've got a question on another point. You just mentioned earlier that there are some low-hanging fruits, like, for example, agriculture. That was what you mentioned. I'd like to mention that I was born and raised in Germany too, and every time I'm here in Kosovo, I sometimes support my relatives which are working in this agriculture sector. And they sometimes jokingly mention that how much money they would make if they would export their products, their yield, into Germany, for example. And it makes me wonder, what is the main reason which is restricting the Kosovan agriculture from flourishing?
I think we are sort of halfway in the process. Certainly if you go back some few decades, agriculture in Kosovo was able to feed the population here. And then we went to a point where more than 90% was imported. We see some changes there. Agriculture is facing, I think, has been and is facing a number of binding constraints. Most important one, I think, in the beginning was the fact that there was not a cadastre system. The one that existed was taken away and had to be recreated. If you don't have land titles, of course you have no access to capital. You cannot buy and sell, you cannot consolidate, you can't really do any of that. And agriculture in the end is a very capital intensive industry. So not having access to any capital, you cannot really modernize or grow that sector. The cadastre system is, or has been recreated. It is working, there are land titles now. And you see that the agriculture sector starts to have access to the financial sector. And still at interest rates that tend to be higher than those for other sectors, but even there are some changes. There are now additional layers of support, whether that's the innovation grants, whether that's the interest rate subsidies through the USAID project. There are a number of things that support that, which I think also has helped to allow the agriculture sector to have the capital to have a much more modern, a much more productive way of producing. I think the really big issue is the health standards when it comes to exporting to the EU. The phytosanitary stuff and so the way you treat milk products and meat and various other parts. That, to a large extent, I think, is being addressed in the context of the EU integration, and the EU is very much focused on agriculture and setting up institutions that help to achieve that. It's super complex, and then I think all the countries in the region are struggling with that. Montenegro is probably the furthest ahead in that, also because they're the furthest ahead in terms of EU integration. I think Croatia is a potential a country that potentially can support the region quite a bit because they have gone through that very recently. And transport, I think, is the other big issue. I mean, agricultural produce, you cannot store it. Okay, if it's processed, yes, it's probably easier. But I don't know if you've got your apples or peaches or driving that to Germany, by the time you get there, some progress clearly has been made, and I think some farmers have used the motorway to Albania, and with that the access to the port. So It is work in progress. It is, I think, super difficult, but if there is any sector that I see drive growth short term, so next 2, 3, 4 years, it is agriculture, and we are seeing it. You look at the supermarket. Products made in Kosovo, you see more and more of that. It is juice, it is honey, it is jam, it's all sorts of things. And the more, and I think the other thing that I think might prove very helpful, often you actually have high quality produce in this sector. And I hear sometimes to the extent that the quality is so high that you cannot sell it domestically because the prices are too high, and you rather produce low quality, cheaper imports. If that is still the case, there's still the possibility to link it to the tourism sector, that is restaurants and hotels. Those that check in hotels are clients that could produce that. These linkages to develop those also takes time. It has to be negotiated, and you have to be able to actually guarantee the supply of produce. That's also the other one. That you have to be able to guarantee that, yes, when you agree that every month you deliver X tons or something, that you actually can. At times it's an economy of scale argument, which is more difficult to handle.
So since time is up and we have no more questions, I would like to thank you for your very informative presentation and respond to our questions. This could be considered also one of the best presentations and discussions we have had within 2 years, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. No, it was really enjoyable and inspirational. I hope it gave some food for thought. You certainly have chosen the right discipline in my view. There's a lot to be done. There's no shortage of challenges, issues, research projects. No, thank you all. It was great.